Becker, sorry.
Thank you, Beth. And I did want to thank MDIC and FDA for the invitation to speak today. It's part of, participating in the pilot was definitely something we thought about. And so what I'm going to go through this morning is why we chose to participate. I think a little background on the program and really our decision making in terms of, participating in this. And then probably what people are more interested in is what the experience was like for us. Tried to capture a snapshot of that as best I can. We just finished the appraisal last Friday. And then I learned from the previous session that leaving a little time for questions may be prudent. So I'll try and do that. And there we go. And a lot of, so really if you take a step back, in terms of participation, really, we participate in some of the MDIC forums and some of the initial discussions, and obviously it really comes down to mission, and that was really one of the first things when we assessed this program, the pilot and participation. We took a step back and we really looked at a lot of the comments from FDA and from MDIC in terms of what this program was about. And, really, essentially it aligned with our core mission, which is providing patients with safe, effective, high-quality medical devices. That is what we strive to as a company. That is, one of our singular most important ways in which we measure ourselves. And so, number one, we felt like this aligned with that mission. It made sense for us. We've all had compliance audits and been part of compliance activities where, you felt like the result on a compliance-based audit, maybe didn't really align with, and you're working on things that sometimes aren't as, like you're working on it because you need to from a compliance standpoint, but at the same time you're kind of saying, I don't know if this is 100% the best use of my time because I feel like this maybe isn't directly really helping us support our mission. And so the opportunity to be part of a discussion, looking at some alternates, looking at whether there were some other viable options to drive that discussion and focus on that a little bit more was certainly appealing to us as well. But a lot of it comes down to the benefits. When we talk through the benefits, again, we really wanted to make sense out of that, and that's what I wanted to go through a little bit is the benefits to us. Yes, there's some economic benefits that come out of this, but really when we look through the benefits for participation, we feel very, very strongly, and part of the conversation was, we think these will improve our compliance, we think we will have higher quality, and we think the benefits for participation in the program do a tremendous amount to facilitate both of those goals. And at the same time, we do think there are, some economic advantages. And so I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but this is what I wanted to do was, many of us probably are familiar with how devices get commercialized globally. And so, we start with doing our design verification validation. We're doing clinical trials. We've manufactured 10, 100, very limited quantities of something. Hopefully that goes well. We proceed to a CE mark approval. We start to commercialize in Europe. We're starting to build more products. We're starting to get more feedback from users who are, using those devices, in the field. Then so we're starting to get feedback on areas of opportunity, both from our manufacturing team, but also from clinical experience that, indicates, hey, there might be some things we can improve. There might be opportunities for us to look at a manufacturing process and make that better. At the same time, we're generally starting to prepare for our pre-market authorization or our PMA submission. What that means internally is that as that submission gets outlined and as we start to look at getting that put together, we start to restrict or lock down what we call lockdown procedures that are essential to manufacturing those devices, because we're trying to make sure we've got all the right revisions. We're trying to get this big, complex submission submitted. And so what happens is we start to slowly narrow and limit our ability to make changes, even though we're starting to get some feedback that there might be some opportunities to improve. Then we go to the submission process. The submission process, depending on the device, complexity of the device, et cetera, could be 6 to 18 months. 6 to 18 months for us is like a nuclear winter. I mean, because what that essentially means is we cannot, our fear is that if we make changes to the underlying documents that were submitted, we'll reset or we'll restart the clock in terms of the timing for an approval. And so that's very, very powerful for us in terms of, you know, obviously we don't want to do anything to risk the timing or the approval process. And so what happens is we sit, and so we have things we know we need to fix, and we have things we know we can make better, but we're not taking action on them. And that's why the streamlined process, and, you know, without knowing the details, et cetera, but, you know, the idea that there's less documents or less information, you know, tied up in that process, giving us more flexibility to continue to manage and improve our business, our operations, and product quality while the submission's under review is very, very positive for us. And the next thing is the 30-day process itself. The 30-day process, what I found in in my internal discussions, you know, I'm at a satellite site for Edwards Life Sciences. We're in Utah. Our headquarters is based in Irvine, California. All of our regulatory leadership is based in our Irvine, California facility. And so, you know, we're a little bit removed from the 30-day process, but even at our site, we have multiple generations of devices. So, you know, we have a Sapien XT device that's still in commercial production, still associated with a PMA. We have our Sapien 3, you know, devices, and that gets very, very complicated because, you know, there's a lot of activity going on that's covered under the 30-day submissions. Add on top of that, that essentially that all goes through our Irvine facility, and so we have other business units or other sites that are also manufacturing PMA devices. And what that causes is we immediately have to prioritize which changes we're going to submit. And so, you know, we may have, for my side, I may have 5 changes that we want to submit that are impactful in terms of corrective actions, improvements to processes, maybe responding to something that happened in the field. But, you know, something from our Irvine site that has to do with, you know, an Intuity valve, aortic valve, that may be a more significant issue that we have to address. And essentially, we have these ongoing discussions of, well, which one gets submitted? And it automatically forces us to make priorities and to limit the number of things that we can think about in terms of changes. The other thing about that process, the 30-day process, is we're limited to a single change per process. It can affect multiple devices, but it has to essentially be a single change. And so again, you think about, we have, you know, maybe up to 100 different devices in all the permutations that are affected, and we've got to sit down and go, okay, I get one change this week, and generally we submit one a week. So I get one change next week, one change the week after. And if you think about the dynamics of, you know, a large-scale operation where, you know, we're making hundreds of thousands of those devices on an annual basis globally, you know, that becomes very, very difficult or very restrictive for us to do a lot of the things we'd like to do for product quality. And then the other thing, you know, and this is just a reality of it, this week is our last 30-day submission for the year. We have vacations coming up. We have reviewers that are playing out of the office. We have, you know, different dynamics, and, you know, that's just a reality of it. And so if you think about all that, what that really tells us is, you know, essentially we have 45 changes that we can submit in a given year. And 45 changes for the level of complexity of our devices, our manufacturing processes, the number of devices, et cetera, you know, immediately puts us to where we're reactive, and we're only doing the absolutely we have to do this type of changes. We're really not thinking about incremental improvement. The other thing that happens to us is, you know, usually what happens is we've got a window and we're planning on I'm going to submit this change next week, and we've kind of got them queued up, and there's a tremendous amount of activity that goes into that. Sometimes changes don't, internally we don't process, or we discover an issue, or things get delayed. What usually happens is we don't always necessarily have another submission ready to go. And so if something gets delayed, sometimes we miss that window. So our 45 changes for the year, really that's a best case. It's really less than that. And so, those are just kind of the realities of that. The other thing that happens, and I'm sure people in the room are familiar with, is what's the next thing we do? We have a conversation of what can we change, or how can we address the issue that doesn't require a 30-day? And so, we have these conversations all the time, and generally what you're really saying is, I'm probably taking a less than desired path to try and make progress and make an incremental change so that I don't have to do a 30-day because I've got all these other things queued up. But at the end of the day, that's not really the change I wanted. So if I think about what I wanted to do, a new fixture, a new inspection process, changing a sequence of events, lots of different things that are lower level than the priorities that are coming up for the 30-day process, we're doing a lot of things that are weak procedural changes. And we kind of go, well, at least that helps make it better because we know we won't get to it. And so, there's a tremendous amount of benefit by what we're talking about with the 30-day process for us to really change how we think about things and our ability to make continued improvement. So, from a compliance standpoint, I can remember the last QSIT inspection we had, and we had a good conversation about Kappa and Kappa timeliness. Obviously, corrective actions do take some amount of time, investigations, et cetera. So I went and looked, and this is another manifestation of the 30-day process in a way. So, we have a lot of 510K devices in our facility. We have a lot of PMA devices in our facility. We have a pretty robust Kappa system at this point. We do open a lot of Kappas, mainly because we want to look at where we're making improvements. We want to make sure they're effective, and we don't want to do so at a pretty broad level within the site. But I look back for Q3, and so really PMA devices, we ended up having almost 20% of our Kappas were late, got delayed, or we weren't processing the actions that we needed to the timeline that we wanted to, simply because we ran into issues with being able to submit that change. We were late, we missed the window, it didn't fall, something else came up that was more urgent or more impactful for the business. And so, we see a distinct difference of our ability to be timely, to act according to plan, and to move forward with changes is different because of the 30-day process. And this was the best way I could summarize it. But again, from a compliance standpoint and operating internally, it's very important. Obviously, if you're taking corrective action, you have something that needs to be fixed. There's some element of whether it's device performance, whether it's a yield, whether it's any number of things, but those are clearly things that we want, recognize, and need to get fixed. But the other thing, and this is, I probably didn't have a full perspective until we had this discussion, the 30-day process for our company is very, very complex. So we do an engineering change, we go through our change process, and that's generally pretty straightforward, obviously follows appropriate regulations, has the appropriate approvals, all that. But that process itself doesn't have all the information we need to actually do a submission. And what happens is, from my side especially, we will process a change. We're like, excellent, got that through, and it's just waiting on regulatory. And then it's just waiting on regulatory. And what happens is they come back and like, oh, wait, we need this, we need this, we need this, so that we can do our submission. And there's a tremendous amount of dialogue that then goes back and forth. There's a tremendous amount of subject matter expertise that has to go into that. And then the review process, the regulatory affairs team does a great job. They're putting together, this fairly complex submission. Well, what do they need to do before they submit it? They want to vet it back with the subject matter experts to make sure, hey, is this right? Did we, is this going to go through? And, because their primary concern is they don't want to have something submitted that then, the reviewer doesn't understand, they kick it back. We don't want to get into that cycle. So we spend a tremendous amount of time, on our end trying to get that piece right. There's also a layer of communications and a whole layer of management within the company that's very complex, because again, we have devices from different sites, devices from different business units, and all that comes into this complex, set of management of making sure we try and meet, at least get 1 30-day in every week. And it was surprising to me the amount of effort and the amount of time and just the amount of complexity that's happening there that gets significantly easier for us because as a site, I can now work on the changes that I need. I don't have all this complex interaction. I can bundle, it's a simplified process. I can bundle them, and I still work with my regulatory affairs team, but it's just a tremendously different picture. And that will, to us, that directly benefits our ability to make improvements that are going to be device quality and compliance related. And so, from our standpoint, being able to look at the 30-day process a little differently, manage that a little bit differently is a tremendous benefit, and we're looking forward to that. So the other thing I want to talk about, because I'm sure everybody's interested to hear it, is the MDBA experience. And so what I will say is it was definitely interesting. And the reason I say that is, we are very used to, we're hardwired to a QCID type audit, a compliance type audit. Going into this event, even at our site, there were a lot of, anxieties, a lot of, what is this really about? And, are we gonna, what do we need to set up? Is this, some backdoor to like give us a list of stuff to work on, and, there was a lot of anxiety and a lot of, hey, is this legit? Is this really going to provide us, positive impact? And, I'm telling everybody, I don't know, but based on our conversations and based on what we understand, the model would be, we feel comfortable that this is a worthwhile activity, and we feel like we'll get, good feedback out of it. Well, immediately it's like, well, were we going to get a bunch of 483s? It's like, no, it's not, And so there was a certain amount of anxiety about that going into it. And the other thing I would say is the MDBA process was about as opposite from a QCID audit, I think, as you can get. It was very, very different. And, so even during the week, and, Becky was our lead appraiser, so she's in the back here. But during the week, I'd be like, hey, how are things going? She's like, oh, they're going great. And like, well, what does that mean? Are we, because you're like, you're waiting to call the executives and go, hey, we're going to get a 483 for this and because it's like that whole preemptive system. And so, she'd be like, I'm like, well, you're getting everything you need. She's like, yeah, we have everything we need. We're good. And that was it. And you're like, I don't know what that means, So it was interesting going through it. But so preparation was really straightforward. So I think we had, sorry, the font's a little bit small on this, but I think we had 3 one-hour meetings with Becky. And even from the first meeting, it was really hard. It took me a minute because she's asking these generic questions about the site. And I'm automatically thinking, risk management. Oh, you need my PFMEAs and we'll get them all set up. And she's like, no. So it took me a little bit to actually understand and sort of deprogram myself from what we think would be typical and what we typically do for a notified body audit, et cetera. So it was really more, what processes did you have at the site? Like processes? Well, the questioning was very, very different. And so it's like, well, we do this, we do this, we do this, we do this, this. And so it was more a conversation of we make annuloplasty rings, which are manual. There's a lot of sewing. There's, they're just a very manual process. We make a lot of devices that essentially are what I call light assembly. I buy some parts in, I have a prescribed process, I get a device at the end. it's in a sterile barrier and, it goes out the door. I also have some unique processes where we do molding of balloons for our catheters. So the blow molding process, much more highly automated, much less reliant on people. And then we have our frames processing for our transcatheter heart valves, which is, again, more automated, but a much different specialty, a much different process. So this whole conversation, we came out with, okay, there's 4 core types of things you do in your site. And I'm like, wow, this is a much different discussion, a much different perspective on what we do as a site and how we're approaching this. So I clearly knew this was going to be a lot different, but it was just, a much different way to look at things and a much different way to approach how the appraisal tries to make sure that it encompasses the representative activities at the site. And so, so we went through that. We went through the scope. That was pretty straightforward. The other big thing for us, and we appreciate the support on this, we really wanted to try and keep this to a week. And that was important to us for a couple reasons. Being able to kind of carve out a week of your calendar time for a site, but then know that, you can kind of then get back to normal the week after, was important to us. And so what that led to after we discussed the site, we have about 1,000 employees at the site, so we're a fairly big site. We make over 3 million individual devices a year. And so, that's a pretty big scope in terms of the activity at the site, from what Becky indicated. So what we then led to is we would do 2 appraisal teams of 2 appraisers each. So really our desire to work within a week drove the conversation of, well, then we need a second appraiser team. And so, which was fine. I mean, we were happy with that, but it was good to have that conversation up front to make sure we could get the scope done for the appraisal effectively, but also meet some of the constraints or some of the requests that we had. The rest of it was pretty straightforward. We booked 2 conference rooms in the facility, and we made sure that we had internet access and a projector available for facilitation of the events. And we chose to have lunch on site just for the simplicity of logistics with the appraiser team. We identified 36 different participants at our facility who participated in the interviews. And for each of those participants, and I'll show you a little bit more detail. So we had about 3 hours worth of activity for those participants. So, if you look at it from what it took for us to manage this as a site, it was really pretty straightforward. We knew which people we needed for each practice area, and we had those scheduled, and they knew they needed this amount of time, but it wasn't a significant amount of time that was, particularly burdensome to any particular individual, which was great. It made for the whole thing to be pretty easy to manage. And then the appraiser team did a nice job of keeping to normal business hours. So they did some additional work off-site, but for the most part, it was fairly easy to, 8 a.m., we would meet everybody in the lobby, good to go, scheduled events for the day, and then about, 5-ish or 5:30, they were ready to go, kind of take a break, and then kind of work outside. So it fit very well with the site activities, and that part of it was easy to support. But really the big thing, and again, this is where we had a lot of anxiety, and a lot of people were like, are you sure this is okay? Is, we didn't have a back room, we didn't look at any procedures, we didn't look at any records, we didn't look at any documents. So, totally different approach. And so it's like, okay, and so that was hard, that was difficult for us to understand that this is going to go okay, but we're not doing any of the things we're traditionally used to. And so, but again, from what this looked like at the site, it was like, okay, we're going to go forward with this. And so this is what our week looked like. And the reason I wanted to show this is, again, for us, going through this, what does this look like? What does it mean to us? How do we have to support it? We had so the green there, we had basically 2 all-hands meetings, what I would call them. And so it was really, really important for us as a site to make the activity very visible site-wide. So we had essentially all the non-production personnel at the site. We did an all-hands kickoff where Becky did a nice introduction. Here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. Here's what the week's going to look like. You know, we're doing this as a pilot program with FDA, and you know, here's why we're participating in it. Here's what the week looks like. And then the blue blocks there are the practice areas, so the actual interviews with the employees. So you can see those are scheduled, and we had this schedule about a week ahead of time, if I remember right. So for us, it was fairly simple to go, okay, for, you know, the 10:30 practice area interviews on Monday, we knew we had these set of individuals. We forwarded them a meeting, scheduled them in a conference room, and that was really it. We didn't have to do a whole lot more before that. So that was, you know, obviously pretty straightforward to manage. I'll call them red because I don't really know what rust, whatever color that is. So those were the validation sessions. And so, and I'll go through this a little bit more, but the validation sessions were set up ahead of time. And what those sessions are is after the interview, all the intake, the appraiser team kind of goes back and forth, and they have some work they have to do to compare the responses, the information they got against the model. And so part of that is, okay, after everything we heard, we think this, this, and this. So then the validation sessions are a presentation of that back to the team that was interviewed. And so what that does is 2 things. It lets the team look at that and go, that doesn't seem right. We must not have talked about this or this, or, you know, here's why we don't think that seems right. But it also, for areas that were identified as weaknesses, it gave the team a little more opportunity to explore that and say, well, what do you mean there? What, you know, because some of it's still a little bit vague. It's, you know, details of the model. We don't know exactly what they're looking for. So it gave the team a chance to get some buy-in, understand when you say that's a weakness, what do you mean? And those sessions were very, very positive in terms of the total outcome. But that's what our week looked like. And, you know, from our standpoint, that made sense. It was scheduled up front and, you know, was pretty straightforward. So again, the scope, we've talked about this a little bit already. You know, the practice areas on the left were what we focused on. You know, we had the option of adding to it, and, you know, I think we knew ahead of time we had enough to digest us getting through this that we didn't want to take anything more on at this point. But talking through a little bit, I think there is the supplier agreement management and the risk management probably do make sense to fold in at some point. And we've got some thoughts on some proposals on that, but they probably do ultimately make sense to be included in here, I think, given the activity that we do on the site. So, you know, one of the things we talk about is, you know, okay, is this really beneficial? Is this process any different? And this was kind of the best comparison that I could do. This is typically what we would see at our facility for a QSIT audit. Again, we have a big facility, a lot going on. So our QSIT audits tend to take roughly 2 weeks when we have those events. We have a dedicated back room. You know, we have information requests. You know, we're collecting documents. We're processing records. We're making sure people that go to the front room are properly prepared for their, you know, what they're going to talk about. You know, we've got a lot of vested interest in that process. And then the person hours. So we had about 240 for the week for MDBA. Typically, we have about 1,500 for a QSIT audit. So I've got some rough costs there. That does include the CMMI appraisal cost as part of that. And so, you know, again, if I look at it just from an economic standpoint, you know, it was absolutely favorable. But for us, the more important thing was it It was planned up front. It had a defined duration. We had pre-planned communication so that we could organize resources and they could plan their days accordingly. And really, we had minimal business interruption. You know, typically, and I know this experience is probably familiar in the room, when you have a QSID audit or that type of audit on site, lots of activity stops. I mean, it just, you know, because of the resources, because of, you know, the complexity and all those aspects, most things stop because you just have too many essential people tied up in the activity. This was, so for our leadership team at the site, there was a 1-hour interview session and essentially a 1-hour validation session. So even with, you know, we had some travel during the week, but even with that, you know, they were able to, you know, support 2 hours a week. That wasn't difficult for us to work in and for everyone else. So it was very minimally disruptive. And I can't stress that enough because I think coming out of it, you know, again, we didn't really know what to expect, but we were able to manage this, you know, and again, make sure that the appraiser team was very supported and had what they needed and felt comfortable so that we got a successful outcome, but in a way that most everything went on pretty seamlessly. So here's a, you know, kind of our initial impression, and again, we just sort of finished last Friday. But, you know, a lot of positives, I think, from the experience, you know, in terms of us as a site engaging in it. It was, you know, certainly from the start, it took us a little while to align with Becky on what exactly she needed, but her approach and the intake was structured and organized. You know, it was pretty easy to go, okay, here, you know, here's what you need. 2 appraisers per practice area, you know, that was definitely a positive because, you know, this approach is based much more on an interview style dialogue with the participants. And so having 2 people that are familiar with the model listening to the same conversations and then aligning on their, you know, their takeaways from that relative to, you know, what's expected or what they're looking for in the model was extremely positive. And I think it was also helpful in that we really didn't have any follow-up. So, you know, they didn't get there and go, oh wait, we didn't get this or we didn't get that. And get through a lot of cycles of, we need this person back again. Hey, can you find this person again? Hey, we need these 2 people again. It made for a very effective process, but I think it made for good results, you know, my guess is, and again, I don't see some of the conversations that go behind that. The validation sessions were great because they gave people an opportunity to participate. It's not like they went and talked and then they got a result and they're like, what happened? What, you know, that's not right, or, you know, just they got a chance to understand a little bit more and learn a little bit more. And then it was very open and engaging. And I think, again, if I look at our experience from a QSID style audit, we are not open and engaging as a company during those audits, right? We are, okay, go in, you're going to talk about this document, answer the question that's asked to you, don't, you know, journey off into any other thoughts you have in your head, be very, you know, 1-sentence answers, you know, I mean, because that's what we're used to doing and that's pretty typical for a QSID audit. This was not. This was, you know, tell me about how you do this. And it's like, what, huh? And so it took a little bit for our team to actually just start talking and start saying, well, we do this, we do this, we do this, and then, you know, the next person, et cetera. And so the process itself was very different, but it was very open, very engaging, and our teams really enjoyed that. So some of the improvements, and I would say this is just something I would probably just have everybody think about as they go get ready for the appraisal. The CMMI services agreement was probably the biggest issue I had during the entire thing was just trying to get that through. And you know, like anything when you're trying to get it through, you know, I made the mistake of actually getting our corporate legal people to look at it before I signed it. But you know, what happens is there's some because there's ongoing data exchange between CMMI, the program office, and the agency, there's some language in there. And because elements of the model itself are intellectual property / proprietary to CMMI, there's some language in there. So just be aware and maybe get out ahead of it in terms of, engage your legal team, let them know it's coming, and just plan some time that there'll be some back and forth of particulars and language and sensitivities to this and that. I was very happy before the appraisal ended to actually get, the agreement agreed to by legal parties on both sides. That's really, and again, for this whole process, that's really the only thing I can say, hey, watch out for, or maybe think about, which to me is pretty complimentary of the process itself. The fact that everything else really went very well, was pretty structured, pretty easy to go along with. The practice area and the purpose of the roles. So Becky had forwarded us kind of okay, here's each practice area, a little bit of a description of what the practice area is getting at and what types of roles we want. And what we found was we did a pretty good job guessing on that, but it was not super clear, in terms of roles that we have. We have a manufacturing engineer, we have a quality engineer, we have a supervisor, we have, and how that aligned with the descriptions. It was kind of dicey to make sure we were including the right people. And then the other thing is the model, and Becky called it model speak. We still definitely don't understand a lot of that, but it was difficult for us to understand sometimes exactly, okay, in the planning session, what exactly really are you trying to look for estimating? And what I find is it's very different from what you're used to from a regulatory environment. The other thing we would recommend doing, very brief, but during the intake, you'll be focusing on certain products or certain work areas. So I would do, after the initial introduction, I would do a quick facility tour before we get into the interviews, just so that the appraiser team can see the areas and at least have a picture in their head and kind of see how work is happening in those areas, so that when they get in the appraisers, they at least have that snapshot. It's not super detailed, but I think it's a helpful connection. And then what we found, we structured the interviews and we structured the team to be very cognizant of the 4 work areas that we identified. And so we had team members from each of those areas, but at the end of the day, that ended up not being as needed to be able to complete the appraisal. What we found is, and what we tried to do was, we picked people that were process and device experts for intricate details of manufacturing an angioplasty ring. But that level of detail is really not what this is getting at. And so, and one of the things that came out of this was, for our site, even though we have these 4 different work areas, they have a common quality system, they're managed similarly, there's a lot of synergies, and so there wasn't a lot of distinction between those. And we maybe could have managed the interviewees a little bit different if we would have thought about and understood maybe the practice areas better and thought about process. Who's most familiar with these types of processes, more to, one step back from that. 4 to 6 interviews for practice areas seemed about right. We had some where because of, the initial planning, we had more. And I think that diluted the ability for everybody to participate. And so I think 4 to 6 sounded about right. And it's important to just kind of think through and pick those well. We did get a very good representation of roles. And then the one thing that's missing, and this may be from our planning or maybe our understanding of it, but also in talking to Becky, I think there's an element that's missing here is engagement of what we call our frontline professionals. The people that are out in the facility every day actually, bonding part A to part B as part of that manufacturing process. We did a really good job of including a good cross-section of our team, planners, buyers, project managers, quality engineers, manufacturing engineers, et cetera. But I don't know that we really felt like we got that essential connection with that level of employees. And that's one of the comments, I think probably at least from our experience, that's probably one of the main comments we have is, how do we capture that going forward? Or, because I don't know that given what we know now of all the practice areas, I don't know that there was a natural fit for that level of personnel into it, but somewhere in there's an essential element of what they bring that I think is important to capture. And then I think the idea going forward, we talked about risk management and the supplier agreement. Those definitely make sense, and I think going forward, some discussion on, we'll have an annual appraisal next year. Can we create a little bit of flexibility so that, areas where we had a lot of strengths, do we really need to cover that again next year? Or can we have the opportunity to do, 11 out of 15, and we cycle in some that we didn't include this time so we get more knowledge, or we make it a little flexible in terms of how we manage that on a continuous basis. I think there's some level of discussion that would be beneficial there. And then we worked really hard on looking at the site by device classification. But at the end of the day, in terms of the appraisal, it really didn't mean anything or really provide any value. And a lot of that is our approach to manufacturing operations at the site is independent of, we don't do something different for a class 3 versus a class 1, et cetera. And so that didn't really provide a lot of value in terms of the appraisal, how the appraisal went. It's more getting the right people cross-functionally to represent and make sure you have a broad mix of people on the site. And then I'll go through this quickly. This was just, we talked to some of the participants. The model and some of the questions were difficult for us to maybe understand right away. And that's really probably what our team struggled with the most, is getting engaged in the process when they didn't really understand it. And we had talked about trying to do some informational stuff, and we decided it probably wouldn't be that helpful in terms of quote, prepping people. But there were confusing terminology like configuration management, requirements, development. Those all mean very specific things to industry and specific things to us. But in the, in the appraisal and the model, they're completely different. And so there's some aspects there that I think we need to think about and harmonize. Or as we've talked about earlier today, there's opportunity maybe to provide some basic, hey, before the appraisal, go through this with your site to at least help ease that transition. I don't think it was a barrier, but it was definitely challenging for people to figure out, am I doing this right? Is this what does this mean, et cetera. The middle one there is probably important in that the results, and I probably should have bolded that. I think the results from our appraisal were, I think they were actionable. I think they were clearly defined in a way that we understand them well enough. And I think that if we spend some time on them, they will make us better. And I feel that the appraisal, the process, and what it highlighted were things that we would not have gotten this kind of feedback from a compliance audit. They were a lot of those other processes that are super important to running a good facility and super important to executing well, but not the kind of things you typically get into from a compliance audit. So from that aspect, the input for us was very valuable, because there are now things that we have that we feel we can make better that are things we weren't looking at before, and that's fantastic for us. We really value that quite a bit. The validation session. So Becky had mentioned typically, or there are different ways of doing the validation sessions. One is do all the interviews and then have one big validation session. Ours were broken into smaller pieces, but even at that, combined a little bit. And feedback from our team is keep those smaller. With the interview team itself would be best, or some level of consolidation, but try and keep those to smaller teams. Partly because the bigger you get that, then all of a sudden you're not getting the feedback. Everybody doesn't participate. The quiet people kind of close down a little bit, and those kind of dynamics happen. But the validation sessions were good. The approach, the appraisers were very effective at, at the end of the day, knowing what they needed and trying to drive the conversation. And so, again, that's where I would go back to Becky, and we'd be done with, sets of interviews, and I'd be like, okay, are we good? Are we not? But the model experts guided the process very well. It was a little ambiguous sometimes in terms of what we were talking about and how that translated. But at the end of the day, they effectively navigated that to get what they needed to do the appraisal. And that was, our teams for the most part were very positive, and it was not stressful. It was a very easy process to engage in. And so, from that standpoint, we thought it was fantastic. Okay, so I think the thing for us after we've done this, and the takeaway is, everybody wants like the formula, the magic bullet, which is, what do I have to do to get high product quality? What's the formula? Is the MDBA, is that the answer? And I mean, ultimately for us, and I think looking at holistically, no, it's not the answer. But it was very valuable, and I think it's an important part of the puzzle. So we look at, I guess we boiled it down to 4 areas that essentially for us we have to get right to have high product quality. And it starts with our products and processes. If we don't understand those, understand how they're designed, understand how they're manufactured, understand the risks, put the effective mitigations in place, validate our processes, monitor how we're doing in management review, all those good things, then we're not going to get product quality right. Our quality system, this appraisal process does not replace, and, I think it augments very well, but you still have to have a quality system that meets regulations, but also is providing you the essential feedback that you need. Making sure you have a Kappa process that's effective, making sure that you're got the fundamentals into your business systems for design controls and validation, verification, all those good things. So that's a must. So I lumped the bottom as site management, and I don't know how to describe it. I didn't have a really good word. But what the appraisal did was a great job of stepping outside of the quality system. It looked more at culture. It looked at how people are connected. Are they synergistic? Are they talking about things we do in the same way? The interview process easily highlighted differences of opinion or conflicts. And that was great feedback to get, but it's all those dynamics, the culture, the project management, not really part of your quality system to some degree, but very, very important to how the facility runs. And so the MDBA got at a lot of those things in a different way. And so we think it was very valuable and very complementary. And then people, and that's really the one that we spent a lot of time on, and we're still trying probably to figure out the right formula. But at the end of the day, the person on the production line or the inspector who's going to be the last person to see that device before it goes in the pouch, those are ultimately the most important assets and resources that we have. And so, continuing to figure out how to measure how they're doing, how engaged they are we facilitating them doing their job the best? And so I think a little more thought on that and maybe how to include that in the appraisal process would be good. But if we look at the next year for our site in Draper, we'll have an MDSAP audit. It'll be, I think, September next year. We'll have our MDBA annual appraisal, which for us, both of those are really important. They're complementary, I guess is how we look at it. They augment each other. It's important to still have that MDSAP touch point. I think it's still important to have somebody looking at your quality system to make sure it's being maintained effectively. And then I think the appraisal adds a lot of other elements that are beneficial to us. But I think if we look at those, both of those for us are defined events that we can schedule and plan around, which as a site with all the dynamics of running a 1,000-person manufacturing facility, having that flexibility is tremendously positive. And it gives us a lot more flexibility to know that's coming, clear people's calendars, effectively support it, but then, keep our eye on all the other things we need to do. And then, so really next for us, I think we've got our final results. So we're going through those. And so the big difference from this process versus, a QCID audit, we have weaknesses that were presented as part of the appraisal. So if they get presented in a 483 format, immediately you're on a clock, you're thinking tactically, you're responding, but you're not necessarily thinking. And what we like about this approach in general is we have weaknesses, we generally agree with them, but we have a little bit of time to think about it. We have a little bit of time to step back and go, all right, what does this really mean? And what do we actually want to do about it in a way that builds and sustains going forward? Because a lot of times when you get into 483 response mode, you pick an answer and you go with it. And maybe it's not the most effective answer, or maybe it's not the best answer, but that's the reality of the situation. So we pushed really hard to have the MDDA last week because we have some time now to look at the results. The first 2 weeks of December for us are generally planning for next year, 2018 priorities, et cetera. So this now is an input to that process where we go, okay, we have these areas we want to spend some time on, so we can think about how to balance that in with the other activities we have as a site. And then we need to think about our touch points with CMMI, how frequently, what kind of works for us. Quarterly probably sounds about right because monthly is probably too soon to make progress. And 6 months seems like it's too not frequent enough to keep us maybe focused. And then, certainly we want to start to explore the additional benefits and understand those processes. And again, because for us, those are very, very important for compliance, very, very important for device quality, and I think they will free us up. And an example of that, and the last thing I wanted to leave you with, is because of this process and in anticipation of the idea that we'll have a streamlined submission process, we've actually started a formal operator, feedback / input intake process. Hey, person, operator on the production floor, what do you see every day that if we changed it makes your job easier, makes your job better? We were always scared to do that because we knew the input we get would not rise to the level of making the priorities for the 30-day process. And rather than getting input from those very important people and saying, thanks for the input, but we really can't get to that, because then that becomes very negative. We now feel like we have a pathway to act on some of those. We've done this in our 510K space very successfully, and it's been very transformative. And we hope to extend that to our our PMA devices. And if we can get to that level where we're balancing, hey, clinicians in the field are experiencing this, you probably need to go look at and drive some action there with, hey, this is what we're struggling with day in, day out to make the device, and we can actually spend a balance there, it's going to be a tremendous outcome. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Baker. Hello. Okay. So did you make any organizational changes, like identify a project manager or something like that, that would see this process through so that you could take action on the areas, the hot spots?
We didn't make any organizational changes. One of the things that Edwards is doing is internally we're doing something we call our Operations Maturity Index. And it's something we're doing that really looks at a lot of the ways we do things and benchmarks them against you know, Toyota's, you know, some of those standards for organizational maturity. And so what we did is we have an individual on our site who is immersed in that activity, and we rolled this into their responsibilities, which is a very natural fit, and created a very natural owner for it. If not, we probably would have had to think about and definitely make sure we identify a person at the site who kind of owns this going forward so we make progress. So we had a natural owner for it, and you know, that person will be folding this into some of the other initiatives we had along those lines. But we would definitely, independent of that, we would need to assign an owner and give them enough visibility to make sure we make progress.
Hey, Rob. Garth Conrad from BARD. You mentioned probably a dozen or more times during the hour you were up there talking that there were a number of situations where your organization didn't really understand the model or the questions that were coming in. So as you know, an army or small army of companies that are out here that are potentially jumping into this process, what would you suggest that we do differently so that we don't experience the pain that you have or had?
You know, I think it's twofold. You know, one of the things that I will tell you is it doesn't necessarily matter whether we understand some of that second level of detail, because it's really all about the results and where we have opportunities for improvement. But that being said, I think with this experience, just so we can align with it better, we're going to look at whether we target some additional training and kind of create some in-house subject matter experts. At least they're a little bit more familiar with it and really can help us. I think our bigger concern is, you know, where we have areas of weakness, if we want to plan activities to improve, we want to make sure we're on target, or that we go do a series of things and that they align with the model in terms of, yeah, those are the right things. And you know, every organization will approach some of these things differently, and that's okay. And the model's actually nice in that it's flexible and that it's not looking for specificity on how you do certain things. But I think our bigger concern was we want to make sure we're making improvements that not only make sense to us, but also are in line with a higher level of maturity to align with, you know, kind of what the model looks for. And I think that's probably our biggest. And we're going to do probably some investment in personnel on site. But I'd say for the initial appraisal, it's not specifically important. And I think if you worry about that too much, you're probably not using your time well. At the end of the day, the process and the appraisers, they led it through so that they got the information they needed, and the results we feel were effective. So I think now I'd say not super important, but I think for an annual basis and to really understand it better and to look at how to drive that internally, then I think we'll spend some more time on additional training, some subject matter expertise.
Robert, more of an observation than a question on your slide 13, that Venn diagram around product quality. Mm-hmm. I think what was very interesting to me is compliance was on the side on a very small font. So we're actually internalizing the values of Case for Quality, where we're focusing on product quality, the people, the process, everything that really drives product quality, and compliance is something that we have to do, but it's to the side. And I thought that was very interesting. I don't know if it was purposeful or if it was
that was not purposeful or thoughtful at all. That's probably just how it fit to get everything the same font size. But I think one thing I would say though is, you know, there are inherent things that are structured within your business to define your quality system that are driven by regulations, but those are inherently very important. And so I don't view any of those those 4 areas, I don't view any one as more or less important. I think they're all very, very related. But a strong quality system and making sure you're driving the fundamental behavior, the feedback, the reaction to things, the understanding of where you need to drive improvement. The regulatory model for that is fine. I think that, you know, how far you drive that in terms of what compliance looks like in terms of how you perform to that is where it starts to drift a little bit from product quality. But I think the essential elements driven from the regulations in your quality system holistically make sense for how you should structure and run a business. And then the MDDA, I think, accentuates that and adds a lot of other things that we don't necessarily think about because we do have that compliance focus.
I have one question from one of our web viewers. Can you talk a little bit about how much time you took to prepare in advance of the appraisal team arriving on site?
So we had our 3 intake meetings, and those were roughly an hour apiece, and that was myself and 2 other individuals at our site. And so, you know, 3 hours there. We spent a little bit of time clearing conference room schedules, making sure we could dedicate 2 conference rooms to the entire week. We spent a little bit of time forwarding the interview schedules to the participants, and that's really that's it. It was not a heavy lift on the front end.
Hi, this is Julie Fink with Roche Diagnostics, and we're in the middle of the pre-cert pilot program for software as a medical device, and we're in the intake process. So what you've described is an awful lot lighter than what we're being asked to do. It really was, my question was almost exactly as the person on the phone, it really was that simple? Okay.
No, and again, that's why if you would have asked me last week, that it all felt kind of vague and squishy, because it wasn't. It's really based on the appraisers and their questioning and their listening and their application of the model, and you don't have to prepare a whole lot for that. And so I think probably the most important thing that we did well and did spend some time on was got the right mix of people to most of the practice sessions so that it was roles in different areas within the facility. So it was a nice cross-pollination. And yeah, it was not a heavy lift at all. It was very, very easy to get ready and fairly easy to facilitate. I mean, at the most, we had to move some meetings and reschedule some things based on availability, but otherwise, the team did a great job of knowing what they needed, executing very well, and making it very seamless for us.
Sorry. So it was all site-focused? You didn't have to reach out to other sites or to a different level in the organization to get expertise in order to support the process?
That's correct. And so one of the things when we looked at enrollment in the pilot, we thought about that quite a bit, and we chose the Draper site. We only wanted to do one site just because of the complexities of trying to manage multiple activities and more than one. But the Draper site essentially is a standalone operations site, and so we have limited interaction with our Irvine facility where we'll take something that's in maybe a pilot production mode, and we'll transfer it in, and then we essentially own it. And so the boundaries of our site are pretty well defined, and the benefits align really well with supporting the activity at our site. So the Draper site most aligned with the potential benefits, and so it was a natural alignment to start with our Draper facility, and then, you know, as this goes on, we'll see if it makes sense to expand that or not. And part of this is just seeing how the experience goes and those kind of things. But we're mostly self-contained. So that was easier and made more sense.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
All right, well, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Cisco Vicente is the program manager at CDRH for the Case for Quality and has been a tireless advocate for the activity within the agency. And I know he's talked to many of you on the phone over the last couple of months. So I'll get to see him in person today, and he's going to give an update on the pilot from CDRH's perspective, some learnings they've had since the October 10th meeting. So, Cisco?
All right, good. So I could see in the back there what's moving and what's going on. So thank you guys for the opportunity. My name's Cisco, and I want to at least highlight a couple of things. First of all, you know, we've got a lot of firms who are actually engaging with us and helping us kind of run through this process. We've got the ones that I think Dr. Sheridan mentioned ahead of time.